Welcome to Surviving Society.
In this second episode of The Poetics of Revolution, I speak with Dr. Delio Vasquez about the rich work of Huey P Newton. Delio is an assistant professor at NYU, working on political thought, Black studies, and questions of colonialism and capitalism. His book, Huey P Newton, I Am We, Intellectual Biography of Huey Newton, forthcoming imminently with Polity Press. I began by asking him to tell us a bit about Newton's life. I'm excited to be talking to Delio Vasquez today, and we're going to speak about Huey Newton. And so I'm just going to begin by asking you, Delio, to tell us a little bit about your engagement with Newton and also about your forthcoming book.
So again, thank you very much for the invitation to speak. I first came across Newton, actually the way that many people do, through popular culture. So specifically, I learned about him through hip hop. Countercultures like hip hop, often carry memory of figures that dominant society has little regard for. As a subaltern culture, hip hop maintains a different arrangement of ethics and principles and values. And that different arrangement allows for different forms of knowledge to be produced and sustained, right? Newton is famous, right? But in a contradictory way, accordingly. Known, but also not known. Has fame, but is also held in infamy. So actually, that's one of my kind of framing kind of arguments about Newton in the book, is that he's known as an image, as a figure, but actually very little is known about him as a person, as a thinker. That famous image of him sitting in a wicker chair is actually one that he hated and didn't identify with at all, because he knew that it would contribute to the production of him as a symbol in a way that he would not be able to live up to or kind of adequately satisfy people's needs or desires, right? In the Black movement broadly, or actually in the movement of the left as a whole, really. So I was in grad school doing a wholly different project on the criminalization of everyday people's kind of efforts to live. And so I was engaging a little bit with Black Panther Party theory, but they weren't a major part of it. But for a lesson that I was teaching, I decided to go to the archives of the Dr. Huey P Newton collection archives held at Stanford, just to do a bit more kind of background research for the teaching lesson that I was doing. And I was blown away by just how much unpublished writing there was, and just how its depth and breadth, ranging in topics from Judeo-Christian theology to evolutionary biology, the Epic of Gilgamesh, obviously writings on political theory and political economy. I drew on some of that material, specifically his early writings on what we today call globalization, what he called intercommunalism. After that, I realized I had a responsibility as a scholar to try to bring attention to just how much intellectual production he had. And I realized that I was particularly well positioned to do that as a scholar that worked on criminalized populations, as a grad student in the same PhD department that he got his PhD in, the History of Consciousness department at University of California, Santa Cruz. There was no visible memory of him represented anywhere. Since the existence of the Black Panther Party, there's only been one scholarly book written about Huey Newton. Again, famous seemingly, but actually not known. That book was written by Judson Jeffries, a Black studies scholar, 20 years ago. Jeffries spends a whole chapter just on defending the value of Black studies. So it was a different time, right? Different expectations even. So the book, I Am We, out with Polity Press next spring, tries to give a broad view and an in-depth view of just the range of ideas that he produced.
That's great. I also had the same experience in the Stanford archives. I was absolutely stunned by how much he'd written, how much unpublished stuff there was, how he was, in his own words, a theoretician. And that seems to have been elided by academics. It is shocking. So the other thing that you said that really spoke to me was about Newton's concepts of revolutionary and reactionary intercommunalism. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what they are. And I find them particularly generative to think about the world today. And I was wondering if you could say how they help you think about, conceive, and perhaps do something, mobilize in the current moment.
I think first it's important to lay the ground that the Black Panther Party as a whole was deeply internationalist when he made this particular intervention called intercommunalism. They had an embassy established in Algeria. They were in deep alliance with multiple international organizations, governments coming out of the decolonial movements of the middle of the 20th century, had developed diplomatic relations with them. Then within this dynamic of burgeoning internationalist relations, the way it was received at the time, take this kind of left turn and argue that actually nation states are obsolete, right? Mm-hmm. For him, I mean, essentially, again, a decade before the term globalization was coined by a Harvard scholar, Newton is arguing that global capital, U.S. military empire, and also technology have rendered nation-state distinctions less relevant than the more determining effect of essentially what he called like a North American empire. His argument was that corporations were dictating the functioning of the U.S. state and the rest of the world, essentially, through their coercive actions, through President Harry Truman called police actions, right? In his when he first entered the war with Korea. Mm-hmm. So, right, there's a thing that Newton kind of lands on when he draws this comparison between the experiences of Black people in the community subject to constant policing and the experiences of third world countries subject to also police actions. But at a certain point, Congress lost de facto, in practice, its right to declare war in the United States, and instead was kind of that the power was usurped by the executive branch through the framing of police actions. And Newton was also concerned with the way that soldiers in the U.S. are exploited in this way, sent to do the bidding of corporations mm-hmm. that control the government that they are subject to, right? And then this distinction that you bring up about reactionary intercommunalism versus revolutionary intercommunalism, he used the word reactionary to refer to this automated way, this automated flattening of conditions for oppressed people globally through the fact of global empire. And revolutionary intercommunalism, then by contrast, is the potential that comes from the fact of those shared conditions. So if more people are suffering the same way, it means that more people can organize together, link up, see their shared conditions as a point of solidarity, and organize resistance on those terms.
I think Newton did say something about the state. So for him, at some point, the state was basically a prison. He said something about how he was in the maximum security prison, but the United States is a minimum security prison as well. So I wonder what you think he has to say about the questions of borders. Are states like prisons, or is there some different logic of carcerality going on there?
Well, I think in that quote, he sounds like he's building directly off of Malcolm X, who made this claim that even when you're outside of the explicit bars of modern prisons, the United States is still itself a prison. Because of his theory of intercommunalism, he believed that the state, the non-state, he says the non-state has already been accomplished. Mm-hmm. The non-state in Marxist thought, the decline of the nation state and its displacement by, again, more kind of flattened, homogenous conditions. So he laments that fact, but he also was a proponent explicitly of a world in which nation states don't exist at all. Yeah, I mean, so he thought that those conditions that Marx proposed had already come to occur, but they were reactionary in their condition. So, right, we see that, goods are able to move across borders more or less freely in many places, but people are not. The destruction of goods is punished, as the right to property is protected, but the destruction of people is treated as an unfortunate side effect, right? As for the kind of the political horizon, he especially was concerned that the rise in globalizing forms of technology would also be, kind of potential tools for people to make use of and exercise their will to liberation, will to power and will to liberation through their effort to kind of reshape history. Does that speak to your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I was also thinking about the fact that although he was quite critical of states and also of the way in which decolonization had been co-opted by comprador elites in Asia and Africa, he also visited Arafat in the 1970s and said he was committed to a Palestinian state. And given the backdrop today of a genocide, how do you think he'd make sense of this moment? And would he still be agitating for a Palestinian state?
So when he visited Arafat, that, it was really quite late in the existence of the party. It was like 1980. Already in 1970, he had made explicit statements in regards to, support for the Palestinian people, and was also took a careful stance. There was some tension actually in the party in the early 70s regarding the Palestine question. Newton did not take the stance that called for the complete elimination of Israel, for example. He thought that it was really important that the people in the territories take responsibility over their local struggles. So he emphasized the fact that there was an Israeli Black Panther Party composed of Mizrahi Jews and Arabs and some Ashkenazi Jews, and he saw he was optimistic about movements internal to the country. He was optimistic and insistent that that's where the right to self-determination came from, for the creation of a state that would be So later he would take the stance of either advocating for a secular state that would allow Jewish people and Palestinian people to live without any conflict within the same territory, or ultimately for the creation of a separate territory. Newton, in his application of dialectical materialism, was careful not to emphasize too much national state sovereignty in a way that was at odds with his theory of intercommunalism. So in the conversation with Arafat then in 1980, according to the Black Panther Party newspaper, right, they were in agreement with either of those as potential solutions. And we know that Arafat was also someone who was strategic in different kinds of stances he took at different times, right? And I'll say I'm not an expert in Arafat, but I'm aware that there's a complex history and kind of scholarly conversation about the range of positions that he took. Here, actually, I'll quote from that statement that Newton put out in 1980. When we speak of our common hopes for the Palestine of tomorrow, we include all Jews now living in Palestine who choose to live with us here in peace and without discrimination. I call upon Jews to turn away from the promises made to them by Zionist ideology and Israeli leadership. Those offer Jews perpetual bloodshed. And I'm sorry, that's not Huey, that's actually Arafat. And I go on, those offer Jews perpetual bloodshed, endless bloodshed. We invite them to emerge from their moral isolation to a more open realm of free choice. And on this, Newton and Arafat were in complete agreement. Mm-hmm. The movement of the Kurds in the Middle East is something that I think that Newton would have seen a lot of value in, also where people seek self-determination and don't necessarily pursue nation-state independence, but are able to struggle for the recognition of rights within a broader kind of social condition. Obviously, Newton would have been appalled by the conditions of genocide that the Palestinian people are undergoing in the present. And, he and the rest of the Black Panther Party drew constant parallels between their condition and that of Black people in the United States. As with the Jews, Newton thought that the responsibility fell on, say, some of these supposed Arab allies, some of these other Arab states, to put pressure on, to help defend the condition of Palestinian people and put pressure on the U.S., as an imperial supporter of Israel. So it also out of that conversation with Arafat, Newton and Arafat were in agreement that Arab states should be putting economic pressure on the U.S. through oil blockades or something to that effect. I hope that speaks to the question.
Yeah, it does. And so much has changed and so little has changed. It's actually quite surprising in some ways that we're here now. But yeah, you talked about the rift sort of between, the famous rift between Eldridge, Cleaver and Newton. But I was interested more in the idea that Newton ended up taking a sort of reformist position. That's one of the criticisms he faces, right? And especially his idea of survival pending revolution, people have said, is a bit of a turn away from the revolutionary impulses of the Black Panther Party in the 1960s. What would you say to that?
Yeah, so one thing I spent time in this book is really reframing that. Part of the reason that Newton is depicted as essentially an insurrectionist early on is due to distortions of the Black Panther Party's program in the popular media. At a certain point, something like 2/3 of news reports on the Black Panther Party were either distorted by or directly planted by the FBI. Newton and Bobby Seale, co-founders, were emphatic about the importance of what they later called survival programs from the very beginning. It's often overlooked that their very first program was not the action of policing police with a law book and rifle in hand, but actually the creation of a stop sign to prevent children from being run over by commuter cars leaving downtown Oakland headed to the white suburbs. All of their programs actually early on were focused on the preservation of Black life, especially the Black youth, against destruction and discarding. When Newton goes into jail in October 1967, a year after the establishment of the party, after this conflict in the street with racist police officer John Fry, Newton is in constant communication with the Central Committee of the Black Panther Party through tapes and conversation and intermediaries and all that. And all through that period, while the Panthers are actually escalating their conflicts with police in the streets, Newton is criticizing this tendency and sees it as self-destructive, not just self-destructive, but at odds with the original aim of the Black Panther Party. If the point of the Panthers is to preserve and defend life in the terms of Malcolm X, then how is it that undisciplined actions in spontaneous actions and conflicts with police would be consistent with that? It wouldn't, right? This tension that ends up splitting the party openly in early 71 was actually debated all through the existence of the Black Panther Party. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason that Fred Hampton, leader in the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, part of the reason that he becomes so prominent in the party in 68, 69, before his assassination, is because he intervenes in the debate. And at a certain point, Eldridge Cleaver, who's advocating for open kind of violent conflict on the streets with police, sides with the Weather Underground. And Fred Hampton openly denounces the Weather Underground this is before the split. This is a year and a half before the split. He denounces them and actually ends up aligning his critique with what Newton had been saying while in prison, while in jail in 67, 68. So to be clear, Newton is pushing back, but he's being overruled consistently. Cleaver is essentially running the direction of the party. Those 3 years that Newton is in jail. When he comes back out, what he's doing then isn't taking a turn away from open violence. He's actually affirming the set of programs that already people like Fred Hampton and the now women majority rank and file membership of the party are pursuing. An emphasis on efforts to preserve and maintain the livelihoods of Black and oppressed people as part of a larger project to transform society. Now, one might ask, and this sometimes arises within debates on the far left, is, well, if you're not willing to engage in open armed conflict, are you actually engaged in a project of revolution, of transforming society, right? Mm-hmm. The explicit plan developed in conversation between Huey Newton, George Jackson, Bobby Seale, was to establish bases of operation grounded in the preservation of the life of dispossessed and precarious people, the lumpen proletariat, right, as they called them, and then engage in military defense, all forms of defense, social defense, psychological defense of those territories. That way, you would actually be arming the people or rather the people themselves would take up arms to defend the institutions that preserve their lives against the immediacy of death. This program of defending basis of operation grounded in survival ends up then not being put into practice. Then through the mid 70s, when Newton's emotional health declines, the party gets mired in underworld politics and dealing, essentially.
You said something about the lumpen proletariat. Can you tell us a little bit more about who the lumpen proletariat were and how they're different from Marx and Engels' conception of the proletariat in general?
Yeah. So, a fundamental cornerstone to the Black Panther Party's thought for Marx and Engels, they use the word lumpen proletariat most often to refer to sections of the dispossessed sell out to elites in power and join counter-revolutionary movements. Specifically, Marx emphasized those sections of the proletariat who are not modern proletariat, those who work but not in modern industry, and thus aren't as likely to take up modern forms of social organization, political organization. But also Marx defined the proletariat in capital as that section, the lumpen proletariat as that section that is most likely to die off. There are many aspects of Marx's conception of the lumpen proletariat that affirm a notion of racial class, where it's a population that is, in his own terms, unable to adapt to change. I think this element of an already kind of racialistic character to the unemployed, underemployed, criminalized set of the population is something that Fanon picked up explicitly. Well, was first taken up by Mao and then by Fanon, Francis Fanon. And for Fanon, of course, it is this set of the population that has nothing to lose, and through their very daily efforts to survive, demonstrate the possibility for a real transformative revolutionary politics. The Black Panther Party read Newton and Seal, read Fanon, and identified their experiences and experiences of the Black community with what Fanon described, identified deeply with those experiences. So for the Black Panther Party, the Black community, even for those that are employed in some kind of regular wage labor, for the Panthers, the Black community broadly is a lumpen proletariat insofar as they are more easily exposed to, again, unemployment, underemployment, criminalization, and death. Exposure to death is really what characterizes this conceptual class. The willingness to resist that comes out of that exposure to death, is one of the things that Newton focused on. But it's also the fact that, if you are at the very bottom of society, you grasp existentially that no one else is going to help you. And so you are the only person truly in a position, you're the only one that's going to save you. And, Newton from early on was deeply existentialist. Even before he became a socialist, he was an existentialist. And he really emphasized will to live that comes out of that condition. And, for this reason, he remained optimistic that the most oppressed are those that are most able and willing to move and change things. And, this ties into his theory of intercommunalism also, in that he saw with the expansion of global capital and austerity and the elimination of a comfortably waged working class, given the rise in automation, he saw the expansion of a lumpen proletariat as a dynamic that would homogenize conditions of oppression for more people in the world, but also conditions of potential resistance for those same people. I could say so much more about that. There's also the experience of being in prison. For Newton, for him, the experience of being in prison was fundamental in shaping and solidifying his conception of what freedom is, period. And he felt that the imprisoned, because of the de facto fascism that they're subject to. He was optimistic that it is a ground of resistance at an existential level. So before he establishes the Black Panther Party, Newton spent some time in prison. He was placed in a solitary confinement cell that was extremely small, had no light, there was no bunk bed, there was no toilet. He was left naked in there, and like many people, at first he had severe kind of psychological reaction. Suicide rates for people placed in these kinds of sensory deprivation cells, is quite high. And Newton, through kind of meditative practice, through physical exercise, was able to ward off madness at that point, when in his mid-20s, and establish for himself a sense of freedom through a refusal of the authorities' seizure and control of his body, right? And his body, mind, and soul. So, again, in those experiences, common to the lumpen proletariat, he saw so much potential. I really could keep going, so I'll stop right there, actually.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Okay, I'll ask you one final question. Given just how expansive Newton was and his many contributions to thought and activism, what, in your opinion, would you say is his most lasting legacy?
In reality, his most lasting legacy is actually quite limited, right? It's something like Black pride and self-defense. It's something that's more or less conflated with Malcolm X. But, right, part of the argument, I make in this book is that he left behind so much more than that. The theory of intercommunalism, when he presented it back then, was not understood. But now we can see the value of his conception of, of political struggle under conditions of globalization, right? And part of what I want to do with this book is to upend and transform his legacy. Maybe a high goal, but that's the aim, right? I mean, that's what we got to go for. He had a conception of a critique of the political party as a form, given his critique of vulgar materialism, mechanistic materialism. He had a conception of that a structured vehicle should rather channel the flux of people's experiences in revolutionary directions, rather than see their value in how many members, how many bodies you have in a political organization. So it's like a phenomenological conception of political organization that he proposed. He developed an incorporation of theoretical physics into an analysis of the limits of language and a monistic, oneness to life itself. He wrote a critique of the prehistoric development of patriarchy, incorporating third world feminist thought, what today we would call decolonial feminism, with evolutionary biology. And just before his later decline into antisocial violence, gendered violence, right? It is a profound contradiction and tragedy that a person who opened his autobiography with the denunciation of sexual violence ends up late in his life falling into it, right? And I think there are reasons for that. I think he was subject to forms of cognitive torture while in prison that profoundly shaped his personality. And at the same time that his capacities for rational analysis were developing and growing through the late 70s, his emotional health was declining, converging with his developing addiction to cocaine, then crack and alcohol, and feeding into these extreme bouts of social violence that were completely at odds with his personal ethics and politics, with the theory that he himself wrote out. So this is stuff that requires examination and a real understanding to grasp what happened to this person who was, again, famous, a leader on a global scale, and who ends up falling into such self-destruction and, again, socially destructive action. And so he wrote about that. He wrote about the kinds of experiments that were being done to prisoners, to black people in that time period, actually. And when I analyzed some of that material in the book to make this argument. But again, there's so much. I would say that his legacy has not been established and written and finalized yet. And we're working on that. All right.
Yeah, hopefully you've done some of that work for us. Thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you for listening. This episode has been brought to you by Surviving Society Productions. To support our work, like, review and subscribe. Follow us on Instagram, Blue Sky and Patreon.